in the Middle East since October 7th. I'm about to leave again for Doha to do broadcasting for Al Jazeera, which has just hands down done the greatest reporting on the genocide in Gaza, with, of course, this horrific slaughter, targeting slaughter of courageous Palestinian journalists. But I was in Ramallah in the summer in the West Bank, and I can tell you that you, SJP, all of you students, are the conscience, not only the conscience of our nation, but your courage in standing up, and often standing up against not just a hostile environment, but a hostile university environment, is not unnoticed. And one of the things that I found in the many years that I spent covering the Palestinians is that they so often feel that they have not only been abandoned, but forgotten. And every time you set up an encampment, every time you carry out a protest, every time you occupy a hall, that message resonates not just within the country, but around the globe, and especially in Gaza. And what you do is so important. And those of us who care, like people in this room, I've lost people in Gaza, and many are missed. I can't thank you enough for your courage and your integrity, and you give us all. Exterminate the worst at it. And this is the terrible lesson of history. If Israel's not stopped and no outside power appears willing to halt the genocide in Gaza or the destruction of Lebanon, Israel will achieve its goals of depopulating and annexing northern Gaza and turning southern Gaza into a charnel house where Palestinians are burned alive, decimated by bombs, and die from starvation and infectious diseases until they are driven out. It will achieve its goal of destroying Lebanon. More than 2,400 people have been killed. Over 1.2 million Lebanese have been displaced in an attempt to turn it into a failed state. And it may soon realize its long cherished dream of forcing the United States into a war with Iran. Israeli leaders are publicly salivating over proposals to assassinate Iranian leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and carry out airstrikes on Iran's nuclear installations and oil facilities. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet, like those driving Middle East policy in the White House, Anthony Blinken, raised in a staunch Zionist family, Brett McGurk, Amos Hochstein, who was born in Israel and served in the Israeli military, and Jake Sullivan are true believers in the doctrine that violence can mold the world to fit their demented vision. That this doctrine has been a spectacular failure in Israel's occupied territories and did not work in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Libya, and a generation earlier in Vietnam does not deter them. This time, they assure us it will succeed. In the short term, they are right. And this is not good news for Palestinians or the Lebanese. The U.S. and Israel will continue to use their arsenal of industrial weapons to kill huge numbers of people and turn cities into rubble. But in the long term, this indiscriminate violence sows dragons. It creates adversaries that sometimes a generation later outdo in savagery, we call it terrorism, what was done to those slain in the previous generation. Hate and a lust for vengeance, as I learned covering the war in the former Yugoslavia, are passed down like a poisonous elixir from one generation to the next. Our disastrous interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Yemen, along with Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982, which created Hezbollah, could have taught us this. Those of us who cover the Middle East were stunned that the Bush administration imagined that we would be greeted as liberators in Iraq when the U.S. had spent over a decade imposing sanctions that resulted in severe food shortages of medicine, causing the deaths of at least 1 million Iraqis, including 500,000 children. Dennis Halliday, the United Nations humanitarian coordinator in Iraq, resigned in 1998 over U.S.-imposed sanctions, calling them, quote, genocidal, because they represented a deliberate policy to destroy the people of Iraq. Israel's occupation of Palestine and its saturation bombing of Lebanon in 1982 were the catalyst for Osama bin Laden's attack on the Twin Towers in New York City in 2001, along with U.S. support for attacks on Muslims in Somalia, Chechnya, Kashmir, and the South Philippines, and U.S. military support to Israel, as well as the sanctions that were imposed on her. Will the international community continue to stand by passively and allow Israel to carry out a mass extermination campaign? Will there ever be limits? Or will the war with Lebanon and Iran potentially provide a smokescreen? Israel's worst campaigns of ethnic cleansing and mass murder have always been done under the cover of war. To turn what is happening in Palestine into an updated version of the Armenian genocide. I fear, given that the Israel lobby has bought and paid for Congress and the two ruling parties, as well as cowed the media and universities, the rivers of blood will continue to swell. There is money to be made in war, a lot of it, and the influence of the war industry, buttressed by hundreds of millions of dollars spent on political campaigns by the Zionists, will be a formidable barrier to peace, not to mention sanity. In Lazarus Chambers, Chalmers, Johnson, Wright, and Nemesis, we abolish the CIA, restore intelligence gathering to the State Department, and remove all but purely military functions from the Pentagon. We will, in his words, never again know peace, nor in all probability survive very long as a nation. Israel has been poisoned by the psychosis of permanent war. It has been morally bankrupt by the sanctification of victimhood, which it uses to justify an occupation that is even more savage than that of apartheid South Africa. Its democracy, which was always exclusively for Jews, has been hijacked by extremists who are pushing the country towards fascism. Human rights campaigners, intellectuals, and journalists, Israeli and Palestinian, are subject to constant state surveillance, arbitrary arrests, and government-run smear campaigns. Its educational system, starting in primary school, is an indoctrination machine for the military. And the greed and corruption of its venal, political, and economic elite have created vast income disparities, a mirror of the decay within America's democracy, along with a culture of anti-Arab and anti-Black racism. By the time Israel achieves its destination of Gaza, Israel is talking about months of warfare that will continue well into next year. It will have signed its own death sentence. Its facade of civility, its supposed vaunted respect for the rule of law and democracy, its mythical story of the courageous Israeli military and miraculous birth of the Jewish nation, which it successfully sold to Western audiences, will lie in ashes. Israel's social capital will be spent. It will be revealed as the ugly, repressive, hate-filled apartheid regime it always has been, alienating younger generations of American Jews. Its patron, the United States, as new generations come into power, will distance itself from Israel. Its populist support will come from reactionary Zionists and America's Christianized fascists who see Israel's domination of ancient biblical land as harbinger of the second coming, and its subjugation of Arabs, and in its subjugation of Arabs, a kindred racism and celebration of white supremacy. Israel will become synonymous with its victims the way the Turks are synonymous with the Armenians, Germans are with the Namibians, later the Jews, and Serbs with the Bosniaks. Israel's cultural, artistic, journalistic, and intellectual life will be exterminated. Israel will be a stagnant nation where the religious fanatics, bigots, and Jewish extremists who have seized power will dominate public discourse. It will join the club of the globe's most despotic regimes. Despotisms can exist long after their past due date, but they are terminal. You don't have to be a biblical scholar to see that Israel's lust for rivers of blood is antithetical to the core values of Judaism. The cynical weaponization of the Holocaust, including branding Palestinians as Nazis, has little efficacy when you carry out a live-streamed genocide against 2.3 million people trapped in a concentration camp. Nations need more than force to survive. They need a mystique. This mystique provides purpose, civility, and even nobility to inspire citizens to sacrifice for the nation. The mystique offers hope for the future. It provides meaning. It provides national identity. When mystiques implode, when they are exposed as lies, a central foundation of state power collapses. All Israel has left is escalating savagery, including torture and lethal violence against unarmed civilians, which accelerates decline. This wholesale violence works in the short term, as it did in the war waged by the French in Algeria, the dirty war waged by Argentina's military dictatorship, the British occupation of India, Egypt, Kenya, and Northern Ireland, and the American occupations of Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. But in the long term, it is suicidal. The genocide in Gaza has turned Hamas resistance fighters into heroes in the global south. Israel has killed hundreds of Palestinian leaders, including Yahya Sinwar. It assassinated Dr. Abdul Aziz al-Rantisi, one of the founders of Hamas, who I knew, and Khalil al-Wazir, who was known as Abu Jihad, founded the PLO with Yasser Arafat, who I also knew. But the brutality of the occupation, which includes daily humiliation, forced impoverishment, indiscriminate violence, long prison terms, and torture, is fertile training ground for resistance leaders. There are no thwarted but radicalized Palestinians who will take Sinwar's place. The long struggle for freedom by Palestinians has made this point over and over and over. Run, the Israelis demand of the Palestinians. Run for your lives. Run from Rafah, the way you ran from Gaza City, the way you ran from Jabalia, the way you ran from Deir al-Balah, the way you ran from Beit Hanun, the way you ran from Han Yunis. Run, or we will kill you. We will drop GBU-39 bombs on your tent and campus and set them ablaze. We will spray you with bullets from our machine gun-equipped drones. We will pound you with artillery and tank shells. We will shoot you down with snipers. We will decimate your tents, your refugee camps, your cities and towns, your homes, your schools, your hospitals, and your water purification plants. We will rain death from the sky. Run for your lives again and again and again. Pack up the few belongings you have left. Blankets, a couple of pots, some clothes. We don't care how exhausted you are, how hungry you are, how terrified you are, how sick you are, how old or how young you are. Run, run, run. And when you run in terror to one part of Gaza, we will make you turn around and run to another, trapped in a labyrinth of death, back and forth, up and down, side to side, 6, 7, 8 times. We toy with you like mice in a trap. Then we deport you so you can never return, or we kill you. Let the world denounce our genocide. What do we care? The billions in military aid flows unchecked from our American ally. The fighter jets, the artillery shells, the tanks, the bombs, an endless supply. We kill children by the thousands. We kill women and the elderly by the thousands. The sick and injured without medicine and hospitals die. We poison the water. We cut off the food. We make you starve. We created this hell. We are the masters. Law, duty, a code of conduct, they do not exist for us. But first we toy with you. We humiliate you. We terrorize you. We revel in your fear. We are amused by your pathetic attempts to survive. You are not human. You are creatures, Untermensch. We feed our lust for domination. Look at our posts on social media. They have gone viral. One shows soldiers grinning in a Palestinian house with the owners tied up and blindfolded in the background. We loot robes, cosmetics, motorbikes, jewelry, watches, cash, gold, antiquities. We mock your misery. We cheer your death. We celebrate our religion, our nation, our identity, our superiority by negating and erasing yours. Depravity is moral, atrocity is heroism, genocide is redemption. This is the game of terror played by Israel in Gaza. It was the game played during the dirty war in Argentina, which I reported on, when the military junta disappeared 30,000 of its own citizens. The disappeared were subject to torture, and who cannot call what is happening to Palestinians in Gaza torture, and humiliated before they were murdered. It was the game played in the clandestine torture centers and prisons in El Salvador and Iraq, which I also covered. I saw it in the Serbian concentration camps in Bosnia. Israeli journalist Yanon Magal on the show Ha Patriotim on Israel's Channel 14 joked that Joe Biden's red line was the killing of 30,000 Palestinians. The singer, Kobe Perez, asked if that was the number of dead for a day. The audience erupted in applause and laughter. We know Israel's intent. Annihilate the Palestinians the same way the United States annihilated Native Americans, the Australians annihilated the First Nations peoples, the Germans annihilated the Herero in Namibia, the Turks annihilated the Armenians, and the Nazis annihilated the Jews. The specifics are different, but the goal is the same, erasure, and we cannot plead ignorance. It is easier, however, to pretend Israel will allow humanitarian aid, pretend there will be a permanent ceasefire, pretend Palestinians will return to their destroyed homes in Gaza, pretend Gaza will be rebuilt, the hospitals, the universities, the mosques, the housing, pretend the Palestinian Authority will administer Gaza, pretend there will be a two-state solution, pretend there is no genocide. The vaunted democratic values morality and respect for human rights claimed by Israel and the United States have always been a lie. The real credo is this: we have everything, and if you try and take it away from us, we will kill you. People of color, especially when they are poor and vulnerable, do not count. The hopes, dreams, dignity, and aspirations for freedom of those outside the empire are worthless. Global domination will be sustained through racialized violence. This lie that the American empire is predicated on democracy and liberty is one the Palestinians and those in the global south, as well as Native Americans and Black and Brown Americans, not to mention those who live in the Middle East, have known for decades. But it is a lie that still has currency in the United States and Israel, a lie used to justify the unjustifiable. We do not hold Israel's genocide because we, as Americans, are Israel, infected with the same white supremacy and intoxicated by our domination of the globe's wealth and the power to obliterate others with our advanced weaponry. As Nick Turse points out in his book on Vietnam, Kill Anything That Moves, the U.S. deliberately maimed, abused, beat, tortured, raped, wounded, and killed hundreds of thousands of unarmed civilians, including children. The slaughters, Turse writes, were the inevitable outcome of deliberate policy dictated at the highest levels of the military. Many of the Vietnamese, like Palestinians who were murdered, Turse relates, were first subjected to degrading forms of public abuse. They were, Turse writes, when first detained, confined to tiny barbed wire cow cages, and sometimes jabbed with sharpened bamboo sticks while inside. Other detainees were placed in large drums filled with water. The containers were then struck with great force, which caused internal injuries but left no scars. Some were suspended by ropes for hours on end, or hung upside down and beaten, a practice called the plane run. They were subjected to electric shocks from crank-operated field telephones, battery-powered devices, or even cattle prods. Soles of feet were beaten, fingers were dismembered, detainees were slashed with knives, suffocated, burned by cigarettes, or beaten with truncheons, clubs, sticks, bamboo flails, baseball bats, and other objects. Many were threatened with death, or even subject to mock executions. Turse found, again like Israel, that detained civilians and captured guerrillas were often used as human mine detectors and regularly died in the process. And while soldiers and Marines were engaged in daily acts of brutality and murder, the CIA organized, coordinated, and paid for a clandestine program of targeted assassinations of specific individuals without any attempt to capture them alive or any thought of a legal trial. After the war, Turse concludes, most scholars wrote off the accounts of widespread war crimes that recur throughout Vietnamese revolutionary publications and American anti-war literature as merely so much propaganda. Few academic historians even thought to cite such sources, and almost none did so extensively. Meanwhile, My Lai came to stand for and thus blot out all other American atrocities. Vietnam War bookshelves are now filled with big picture histories, sober studies of diplomacy and military tactics, and combat memoirs told from the soldier's perspective. Buried in forgotten U.S. government archives, locked away in the memories of atrocity survivors, the real American war in Vietnam has all but vanished from public consciousness. Historical amnesia is a vital part of extermination campaigns, once they end, at least for the victors. But for the victims, the memory of genocide, along with a yearning for retribution, is a sacred calling. The vanquished reappear in ways the genocidal killers cannot predict, fueling new conflicts and new animosities. The physical eradication of all Palestinians the only way genocide can work, is an impossibility, given that 6 million Palestinians alone live in the diaspora, while 5 million live in Gaza and the West Bank. Israel's genocide is enraged the 1.9 billion Muslims worldwide, as well as most of the global South. It has discredited, weakened the corrupt and fragile regimes of the dictatorships and monarchies in the Arab world, home to over 450 million Muslims who collaborate with the US and Israel. It has fueled the ranks of Palestinian resistance, and it has turned Israel and the US into despised pariahs. Now, what is happening in Gaza is not unprecedented. Indonesia's military, backed by the US, carried out a year-long campaign in 1965 to exterminate those accused of being communist leaders, functionaries, party members, and sympathizers. The bloodbath, much of it carried out by rogue death squads and paramilitary gangs, decimated the labor union movement, along with the intellectual and artistic class, opposition parties, university student leaders, journalists, and ethnic Chinese. 1 million people were slaughtered. Many of the bodies were dumped into rivers, hastily buried, or left to rot on roadsides. This campaign of mass murder is today mythologized in Indonesia, as it will be in Israel. It is portrayed as an epic battle against the forces of evil, just as Israel equates the Palestinians with Nazis. The killers in the Indonesian war against communism are cheered at political rallies. They are lionized for saving the country. They are interviewed on television about their heroic battles. The 3 million strong youth group, Indonesia's equivalent of the brown shirts or the Hitler Youth, in 1965 joined in the genocidal mayhem and today are held up as pillars of the nation. We too mythologize our genocide, Native Americans, romanticizing our killers, gunmen, outlaws, militias, and cavalry units. We, like Israel, also fetishize the military. Our mass killing in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, what the sociologist James William Gibson calls techno-war, defines Israel's assault on Gaza and Lebanon. Techno-war is centered on the concept of overkill. Overkill, with its intentional large numbers of civilian casualties, is justified as an effective form of deterrence. Every horrifying act of Israel's genocide has, however, been telegraphed in advance, and it has been telegraphed in advance for decades. The dispossession of Palestinians of their land is the beating heart of Israel's settler colonial project. This dispossession has had dramatic historical movements, 1948 and 1967, when huge parts of historic Palestine were seized and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were ethnically cleansed. Dispossession has also occurred in increments, the slow motion theft of land and steady ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The incursion on October 7th into Israel by Hamas and other resistance groups gave Israel the pretext for what it has long craved, the total erasure of Palestinians. Israel has now damaged and destroyed all of Gaza's universities, 60% of its educational facilities, including its libraries, over 195 heritage sites, including 208 mosques, churches, and Gaza's central archives that held 150 years of historical records and documents. Israel's warplanes, missiles, drones, tanks, artillery shells, and naval guns daily pulverize Gaza, which is only 20 miles long and 5 miles wide. And a scorched earth campaign unlike anything seen since the war in Vietnam. It has dropped 25,000 tons of explosives, that's the equivalent of 2 nuclear bombs on Gaza, many targets selected by artificial intelligence. It drops unguided munitions, dumb bombs, and 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs on refugee camps and densely packed urban centers, as well as so-called safe zones. 42% of Palestinians killed have been in these Israeli designated safe zones. Over 1.9 million Palestinians, that's 9 out of every 10, in Gaza have been displaced, forced to find refuge in overcrowded UNRWA shelters, hospital corridors, courtyards, schools, tents in the open air, often living next to fetid pools of raw sewage. Israel has killed at least 42,600 Palestinians, mostly women and children, and wounded 99,800 others since October of last year, although with thousands, perhaps tens of thousands missing, no doubt buried beneath the rubble, these numbers are far higher. It has slaughtered as many, or is slaughtering as many as 187 people a day. The last 2 weeks, it's killed almost 800 people just in northern Gaza and Jabalia, including 75 children. It's killed over 128 journalists, many of them deliberately targeted. It has killed doctors, nurses, 4% of Gaza's health personnel, and at least 220 UN aid workers, the highest death toll in UN history. Doctors are forced to amputate limbs without anesthesia. Those with severe medical conditions die from lack of treatment or will die soon. Over 100 women give birth every day with little or no medical care. Miscarriages are up by 300%. Over 90% of the Palestinians in Gaza suffer from severe food insecurity, with people reduced to eating animal feed and grass, especially in the sealed-off section of northern Gaza. Children are dying of starvation. Palestinian writers, academics, scientists, and their families have been carefully tracked and assessed. 70% of reported deaths have consistently been women and children, writes Francesca Albanese, the special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. She banned Israel will not allow her enter. She has a new report coming out Monday. Israel has failed to provide the remaining 30%, i.e. adult males, has failed to prove that the remaining 30%, i.e. adult males, were active Hamas combatants, a necessary condition for them to be lawfully targeted. By early December, Israel's security advisors claimed the killing of 7,000 terrorists in a stage of the campaign when less than 5,000 adult males in total had been identified among the casualties, thus implying that all adult males killed were terrorists. Israel plays linguistic tricks to deny anyone in Gaza the status of civilians, and any building, including mosques, hospitals, and schools, protected status. Palestinians are all branded as responsible for the attack on October 7th, or written off as human shields for Hamas. All structures are considered legitimate targets by Israel because they are allegedly command centers or said to harbor Hamas fighters. These accusations, Albanese writes, are, quote, a pretext used to justify the killing of civilians under a cloak of purported legality whose all-enveloping pervasiveness admits only of genocidal intent. In scale, we have not seen an assault on the Palestinians of this magnitude. But all these methods, the killing of civilians, dispossession of land, arbitrary detention, torture, disappearances, closures imposed on Palestinian towns and villages, house demolitions, revoking residence permits, deportation, destruction of the infrastructure that maintains civil society, military occupation, dehumanizing language, theft of natural resources, especially aquifers, have long defined Israel's campaign to eradicate the Palestinians. The occupation and the genocide, however, would not be sustained without the U.S., which gives Israel $3.8 billion in annual military assistance. The U.S. has spent $17.9 billion on military aid in Israel from October 2023 to October 2024. This genocide is the culmination of a process. It is not an act. The genocide is the predictable denouement of Israel's settler colonial project. It is coded within the DNA of the Israeli apartheid state. It is where Israel had to end up. and Zionist leaders have been open about their goals. Short, annihilate the Palestinians. Annihilate them the same way Native Americans were annihilated, First Peoples, Nations peoples in Australia, or Armenians were annihilated by the Turks. The specifics are different, the process is the same, and we cannot plead ignorance. We know what happened to the Palestinians. We know what is happening to the Palestinians, and we know what will happen to the Palestinians. But it's easier to pretend that there will be a ceasefire, pretend that Palestinians will return to their homes. And the genocide exposes once again our vaunted morality and our respect for human rights as a fiction. Genocide is always done by attrition. Once a targeted group is stripped of its rights, the next steps are the displacement of the population, destruction of the infrastructure, and the wholesale killing of civilians. Israel is at the same time attacking and killing international monitors, human rights organizers, aid workers, and UN staff, a feature of most genocides. Along with its assault on the United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, Israel has been attacking the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, where peacekeepers have been fired upon, tear gassed, and wounded. This tactic replicates the Bosnian Serb attacks in July 1995, which I covered, on the UN Protection Force outposts in Srebrenica. The Serbs, like the Israelis, had cut off food deliveries to the Bosnian enclave, resulting in severe malnutrition and starvation, and then overran the UN outposts, took 30 UN troops hostage before massacring more than 8,000 Bosniak Muslim men and boys. The initial phase in Gaza is complete. The final phase is mass death, not only from bullets and bombs, but famine and disease. No food has entered northern Gaza since the beginning of this month, and food deliveries through Rafah to the south have been severely curtailed. Israel has been dropping leaflets in the north to tell the 400,000 Palestinians there that they must leave or die. It has ordered the evacuation of hospitals. We should be noted, Israel is also targeting hospitals in Lebanon. It's deployed drones to fire indiscriminately on civilians, including those attempting to take the wounded for treatment. It has bombed schools that serve as shelters, and has turned the Jabalia refugee camp into a free fire zone. As usual, Israel continues to target journalists, including Al Jazeera's Fadi El-Wahidi, who was shot in the neck and remains in a coma. Israel will not allow his evacuation for medical treatment. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs warns that aid shipments to all of Gaza are at their lowest level in months. This total stage is the next stage, incremental death, and the primary weapon, which is already happening in the north, will be famine. Egypt and the other Arab states have refused to consider accepting Palestinian refugees, but Israel is banking on creating a humanitarian disaster of such catastrophic proportions that these countries or other countries will relent so they can depopulate Gaza and turn their attention to ethnically cleansing the West Bank. That's the plan, although no one, including Israel, knows it will work. There is only one way now to end the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and it is not through bilateral negotiations. These laws, as they often do, conflict with moral law. We must stand, no matter the cost, with the crucified of the earth. If we fail to take this stand, whether against the abuses of militarized police, the inhumanity of our vast prison system, or the genocide in Gaza, we become the crucifiers. Israel and the U.S. may win this, but ultimately they have signed their own death warrants.